It had rained that morning. Not the kind of rain that brought thunder or drama, just a soft drizzle, as if the sky itself were sighing. Margaret Ellis sat quietly by the window of her small house in Maple Hollow, a town that felt forgotten by time. She watched the water slide down the glass pane in narrow rivers, tracing each droplet as if hoping one of them would spell out an answer she'd waited 52 years to receive. The living room was dim, lit only by the gentle light that filtered through the clouds. Her fingers, now marked by age and time, clutched a yellowed photograph. Two young lovers at a county fair, she in a summer dress with wildflowers in her hair, he in a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, eyes full of dreams. His name had been Thomas Avery. He had promised her everything. They had been barely 20, bold and breathless, stealing kisses behind church halls and whispering about running away to California. He had enlisted in the Navy, said he'd be gone for only 6 months, said he'd write every week, said he'd come back and marry her under the old oak tree behind her father's barn. But the letters stopped after the 5th one, and Thomas Avery never came back. Margaret had waited. At first, days turned into weeks, then months. A year passed. People told her to move on. Some said he had died. Others whispered he'd run off with someone else. But Margaret refused to believe either. There was no funeral, no explanation, just a silence that hollowed her heart and stole her smile. By the time she turned 30, she married someone else. Not out of love, but out of the weight of time and expectation. Harold was kind. He was steady. But he was not Thomas. And even in the quietest moments of her marriage, Margaret would wonder what her life might have been, if only Thomas had kept his promise. Now, at 74, she lived alone again. Harold had passed 20 years ago. Her only son moved to Oregon, called every Christmas but hadn't visited in years. She had neighbors, polite ones, but no one really knew her, not in the way Thomas had known her, not in the way that mattered. Every Thursday, she brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window with the same ritual, reading old letters, looking at the same pictures, listening to the stillness of a house too quiet for comfort. That afternoon, she reached for a small wooden box she kept on the shelf above the fireplace. Inside were the last letters Thomas had sent. 5 in total, each read a dozen times, each crease etched with longing. There was also a small gold ring. He had sent it in the second letter, a promise that he'd place it on her finger himself when he returned. She had never worn it. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the ring. She pressed it against her lips and closed her eyes, whispering a name no one had spoken aloud to her in decades. Thomas. The rain had stopped. Outside, the wind shook the old trees gently, scattering leaves across the front porch. Margaret sighed, set the box down, and made her way to the kitchen to warm the kettle. And then, 3 knocks on the door. Sharp, deliberate, unexpected. She froze. No one visited her without calling. Her heart skipped. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something she hadn't felt in years. A strange pull of the past clawing its way into the present. She hesitated. 3 more knocks. Margaret walked slowly toward the door, her pulse drumming louder than the wind outside. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she opened it. What she saw on the other side would change everything. At first, she didn't recognize him. He stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair tucked beneath a wet baseball cap. His face was weathered, deeply lined like hers, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes, were unmistakable. Not his, no, but familiar. The man removed his cap, offering a polite, uncertain smile. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Are you Margaret Ellis?" She nodded slowly, gripping the doorframe. "Yes." He paused, eyes scanning her face. Then he exhaled, almost in relief. "My name is Samuel. Samuel Avery." The name hit her like a wave of cold water. Avery. She staggered back half a step, lips parting in disbelief. "Avery," she whispered. He nodded gently. I think I think I'm your Thomas's son." The world tilted. Margaret felt the room spin, though her feet hadn't moved. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the porch screen. Her hand went to her chest, trying to steady her heart. I don't understand," she said. Samuel looked down, then back at her with eyes that shimmered. "He passed away last month. My mother, too, just 6 weeks before him. In her final days, she told me everything. She gave me a box of letters, and in those letters, your name was on every page." Margaret's knees weakened. She leaned against the doorframe, blinking back tears. He never forgot me?" Samuel shook his head. "Not for a second." She opened the door wider. "Come in." He stepped inside, dripping from the rain, and stood awkwardly in the living room as if entering a memory he didn't own. His eyes landed on the fireplace mantel, on the small wooden box she'd been holding just minutes before. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, aged, sealed in red wax. "My father wrote this for you. He said I should find you. Make sure you read it." Margaret took the letter in shaking hands. Her fingers brushed the seal and 1,000 memories rushed through her. The smell of Thomas's cologne, the way he used to laugh, how he used to say her name like it was a song. She didn't open the letter yet. Instead, she looked up at the stranger who had brought her past back to life. His face, though unfamiliar, held pieces of Thomas, the shape of his jaw, the kindness in his expression, the way he waited patiently, just like his father had done that summer so long ago. "Would you like some tea?" she asked softly. Samuel smiled. "I'd like that." They sat at the kitchen table, two strangers connected by a name, a love, and the quiet ache of time. The kettle whistled. She poured the tea with care, hands still trembling. The letter lay between them like a sleeping truth waiting to awaken. As the rain started again, tapping gently against the windows, Margaret reached for the envelope and began to open it. Margaret unfolded the letter with careful hands, the paper soft and yellowed with age, yet miraculously preserved. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and then everything around her. The ticking clock, the sound of the rain, even Samuel, seemed to fade away. The words were in Thomas's handwriting. She'd know it anywhere. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and my son has found you, just as I always prayed he would. There are things I should have told you long ago, and it haunts me every day that I never got the chance." Her eyes stung, but she kept reading. "I didn't leave you, Margaret. I was taken. Shortly after I wrote my 5th letter, I was deployed overseas. The mission was supposed to be short, but everything changed. We were captured. I was held for over 2 years, far from home, with no way to send word. When I finally returned, I came back to find that my letters had stopped reaching you. Your father told me you'd moved on, that you'd married someone else. He said you wanted nothing more to do with me." Margaret gasped aloud. Her father, her own father. He had hated Thomas, thought he wasn't good enough for her, not from the right kind of family. But she never imagined he would go that far. She clenched the edge of the table, blinking back tears. "I was shattered. But I respected what I believed was your choice. I left town, joined a construction crew down in Mississippi trying to rebuild a life I didn't want. Years passed. Then I met Clara. She was kind. She helped me find pieces of myself. We built a family. I loved her, but not the way I loved you. Never that way." She glanced up at Samuel. He was watching her quietly, not intruding, not pressing, just there, present. "I never stopped loving you. I kept your letters, your photos, and even as my hair turned gray, I dreamed that one day, maybe we'd meet again. Maybe I could explain. Maybe I could say goodbye properly. I'm sorry I waited too long. I hope this letter brings you some peace, and I hope my son brings you something more, a connection to the life we never got to live, and maybe even a new chapter you didn't expect. Always yours, Thomas. Margaret placed the letter down gently. Silence fell between them like snow. Her mind was a storm. Grief, betrayal, relief, love, all crashing at once. The truth hurt, but it also healed. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't chosen to leave. She had been loved all along, even in silence. She looked at Samuel again, her voice soft and steady. You came all this way. Why? Samuel smiled gently. Because I needed to see you, and because I think part of my father never left you. I wanted to find that peace. I think I needed it too. Tears slid down Margaret's face, but this time they weren't from sorrow alone. There was something else in them now. Hope. She reached across the table and took Samuel's hand. Then let's not waste another minute. The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains of Margaret's kitchen, bathing everything in a golden hue. The rain had passed, but its memory lingered in puddles on the sidewalk and the soft scent of wet earth. Samuel was still there. He had slept in the small guest room, the same room where Margaret's son used to stay during summer visits as a boy. She had offered it without hesitation, and he had accepted like someone who already belonged. Margaret stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. Her hands moved with quiet purpose as if cooking for someone else had stirred a long-lost part of her. Samuel entered, rubbing his eyes and smiling sheepishly. "Something smells like my childhood," he said. Margaret chuckled softly. "My pancakes were famous once. Your father ate 6 in one sitting the first time I made them. Nearly gave himself a stomachache." Samuel sat at the table, the same table where she had read his father's final letter. The weight of that moment still lingered, but it was softer now, no longer sharp, like a scar that no longer hurt when touched. After breakfast, they stepped outside. The morning was crisp and Margaret suggested a walk. She led Samuel down the winding path behind her home, through a small grove of trees until they came to a clearing. There, standing tall and alone, was the old oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, weathered but strong. Beneath it, the earth was firm and shaded. Margaret looked up at it with a gaze full of memories. "This is where he asked me to marry him," she said quietly. "Under this very tree." Samuel stepped closer, looking up as if trying to see what she had once seen. "He told me stories about a tree like this. Said it was his favorite place in the world. He wanted to build a swing here. Said when we had children, we'd bring them here every Sunday." Margaret's voice caught in her throat. Samuel turned to her, his voice gentle. "I can build that swing." She blinked, stunned. "I mean it," he said. "You've waited 52 years for something. Maybe it's not too late to have it. A piece of it, at least." Margaret looked at him. Not as the son of a lost love, not as a ghost of what could have been, but as a man offering her something real. Something now. She nodded. They spent the afternoon in town, gathering supplies. Samuel bought rope and a sturdy wooden plank. Margaret picked up fresh apples from the market, something she hadn't done in years. When they returned, Samuel worked in the fading sunlight, tying knots, measuring balance. Margaret watched from a nearby bench, her heart full and strange. By evening, the swing was done. She stood beside it, fingers tracing the smooth wood. "Sit," Samuel said, smiling. She hesitated, then lowered herself gently onto the swing. The wood creaked, the rope held. She closed her eyes as he pushed her gently, back and forth, the breeze on her face, the oak tree rustling above. For a moment, she felt 20 again, and in that space between memories and motion, Margaret Ellis smiled wider than she had in decades. That evening, after the swing had been tested and tea had been poured once more, Margaret sat quietly in her living room, staring at the flickering fireplace. Samuel was nearby, leafing through an old photo album she'd pulled from the shelf. She watched him carefully, how he handled each page with reverence, pausing at certain images longer than others. It was like watching someone discover pieces of themselves in someone else's life. "You look just like him in this one," she said softly, pointing to a photo of Thomas at 22, standing beside a blue truck. His smile was crooked, boyish, exactly like Samuel's. He turned the album toward her. "Who's this?" Margaret leaned in. "That was my sister, Ruth. She passed some years back. She's the one who helped me keep those letters hidden from my father. If it weren't for her, I might have lost every trace of Thomas." Samuel nodded slowly. "You've held on to so much." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the hallway. "There's more." "I think," she said. "I haven't been up in the attic in years. But something tells me there's something waiting there." With a flashlight in hand and Samuel following close behind, she led the way up the narrow wooden steps. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, of time and secrets. Cobwebs hung in the corners and old trunks lined the walls like forgotten soldiers of the past. She opened one box after another: holiday decorations, baby clothes, her son's school drawings. And then, beneath an old quilt, she found it: a small, leather-bound journal. She sat on the floor and opened it carefully. The first page was dated July 1971. Margaret's eyes widened. This was mine. The entries were short, but full of ache. July 18th. No letter this week. Still no word. But I know he'll write. August 3rd. I saw his mother at the grocery store. She said she hasn't heard from him either. I'm worried. September 12th. I asked my father if he's hiding letters. He got angry, slammed the door. I'm afraid to ask again. Samuel leaned closer. "He really kept them from you." She nodded, her voice breaking. "He wanted me to forget him. He thought he was protecting me from disappointment. Or maybe protecting himself from losing control." She flipped through more pages, finding drawings of wedding dresses, notes about future baby names. "Lily, if it's a girl," one page read. "Benjamin, if it's a boy." Samuel's eyes welled with emotion. That was almost me. Margaret smiled through her tears. Maybe it still is. At the very back of the journal was something unexpected: a folded piece of paper taped to the last page. She peeled it loose and opened it. It was a poem, written in Thomas's handwriting. "If ever I should fade from view, and time takes me far from you, know my love, steadfast and true, is waiting still, beneath the blue." A sob caught in Margaret's throat. She pressed the poem to her chest. Samuel reached over and placed his hand on hers. "You were his first love," he said quietly. "And you're the last person he wrote poetry to." They sat there in the attic for a long time, surrounded by boxes and dust and ghosts of what could have been. But also something else: peace. Margaret realized then that not all love stories end with weddings or promises fulfilled. Some end in reconnection, in healing, in a swing under an oak tree and a journal rediscovered. And sometimes that's more than enough. A week had passed since Samuel first knocked on her door. In that time, the quiet house had filled with laughter, conversation, and the aroma of fresh meals cooked side by side. The swing under the oak tree had become a ritual: morning coffee for her, afternoon reading for him. They moved around each other with the ease of people who had known one another far longer than they actually had. One evening, as golden light filtered in through the living room windows, Samuel stood at the kitchen counter drying dishes while Margaret sat nearby folding linens. "You know," he said, not looking up, "I never really had a place I called home." Margaret turned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I moved a lot after college, went from job to job, apartment to apartment. I even spent 2 years living out of a camper. Never married, never had a reason to stay in one place." Margaret paused, sensing something deeper in his voice. "I thought I was okay with that," he continued. "But ever since I came here, I feel something different. I feel settled." She placed a towel on the table and looked at him fully now. "Are you thinking about staying?" Samuel hesitated. Then he nodded. "I am." Her breath caught. "I mean, if it's all right with you," he said quickly, "I wouldn't want to impose. I could rent a room in town or find something nearby, but I'd like to be close. I'd like to help you with the house, keep you company if you'll have me." Margaret blinked, speechless for a moment. No one had ever offered to stay. People visited, called, wrote, then left again. But Samuel, this man who had brought her the final piece of a story she thought unfinished, wanted to begin something new with her. Not as a replacement for Thomas, not as a duty, but as someone choosing to be part of her life. She smiled, slow and genuine. "You don't need to find a room in town. There's one right here, already made up." He looked surprised. "Are you sure?" "I've been alone for a long time, Samuel. And you carry a part of someone I loved with all my heart. But more than that, you've become someone I care about deeply on your own." He crossed the room and sat beside her, his eyes full of quiet emotion. "I think my father would have wanted this." Margaret nodded. "I think he does." That night, they ate dinner under the stars, wrapped in shawls and blankets, the swing creaking gently nearby. Margaret told stories of the past she hadn't spoken of in years. Samuel shared his childhood memories, ones that made her laugh, others that made her cry. And somewhere between laughter and tears, they found something rare, a second chance neither of them had expected. Not a romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but something just as sacred. Family. A few days later, while cleaning the hall closet, a space Margaret hadn't dared touch in years, Samuel found a small wooden box wedged behind an old suitcase. It was dusty, plain, and sealed with a brass latch. No markings, no key. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, handing it to Margaret. She stared at it, her brows furrowing. "I haven't seen this in decades," she whispered. "It belonged to my mother, but I think Thomas gave it to her." Samuel's eyebrows lifted. "He gave a gift to your mother?" Margaret chuckled softly, almost embarrassed. "He was trying to win her over. My father never liked him, but my mother, she had a soft spot for him. One day he came to our house with this box, told her it was a music box from his grandmother's collection, said it played a melody that made people fall in love." Samuel smiled. "Did it work?" "Well, she didn't throw him out of the house," Margaret said. "That was something." They sat together in the living room as Margaret dusted it off, fingers brushing over the smooth wood. She held it up to the light and noticed something she hadn't before. A faint engraving, nearly worn away by time. "For the one who waits." Her breath caught. "I never saw this." "Think it still works?" Samuel asked. "There's only one way to find out." They managed to pry it open with a thin butter knife. Inside was a tiny rusted winding key. Margaret turned it slowly, cautiously until the mechanism caught. Then the music began. It was faint, trembling like a voice waking from sleep. The melody, simple, haunting, beautiful, filled the room. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. She closed her eyes. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the song Thomas hummed the day he said goodbye. I never knew where it came from. He said it was his mother's favorite tune." Samuel sat quietly beside her, letting the moment wrap around them like a warm blanket. As the music played, something inside the lid clicked. Margaret opened it fully and gasped. Inside, hidden beneath a false bottom, was a folded piece of paper. She carefully pulled it out, hands trembling now, almost afraid of what she might find. It was another letter, short, handwritten, in Thomas's voice. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means somehow, somewhere, the stars aligned and you found this box. I couldn't say goodbye the way I wanted. I couldn't tell you everything. But I hope, with all my heart, that you know how much I loved you. still love you. This melody, I wanted it to be ours. So I hid it here, waiting, hoping. I never stopped believing in you. If love can last beyond time, beyond distance, beyond death, then ours surely has. Yours forever, Thomas. The letter trembled in her hands as silent tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't cry from sadness. She cried because of what had endured, what had waited, what had never left her. Samuel placed his hand over hers once more, and this time he didn't need to say anything. They sat in the soft hush of the music, the note held between them, and the melody that once began a love story now playing softly into its beautiful continuation. The next morning, Margaret stood under the oak tree, music box in hand, the old swing swaying gently in the breeze. The melody from the night before still echoed in her mind, wrapping around her heart like a soft scarf from long ago. Samuel stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her, then followed her gaze toward the branches. "I was thinking," she said quietly, "it's time to give Thomas a place to rest." Samuel nodded. "I was thinking the same." That afternoon, they drove to the edge of town to a small memorial shop. Margaret picked out a bronze plaque with trembling hands. The engraving would read, "Thomas Avery, 1950-2023, forever beneath the tree we dreamed under." She brought home a small urn, simple, elegant, something she could keep near the roots of the oak tree. 2 days later, they held a quiet ceremony. Just the 2 of them. The sky was soft and blue, dappled with clouds. Birds sang lazily from the trees. Margaret wore her mother's old shawl, the one she used to wear on Sunday mornings, and Samuel wore a navy blue jacket that had once belonged to his father. They stood together beneath the tree. Margaret knelt, her hands pressing the earth gently as she placed the urn in a hollow she and Samuel had dug. She laid the music box beside it, still working, still playing that haunting tune. Then she set the plaque against the base of the tree and whispered, "You came back to me, just like you said you would." Samuel rested a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. After a moment of silence, Margaret rose. She looked at Samuel, eyes glassy but peaceful. "I think I'd like to write again," she said. "Write? Stories, letters, maybe even a memoir. I want to remember it all. Not just the pain, but the love, the waiting, the hope." Samuel smiled. "I think people would love to read that." That evening, back inside the house, Margaret opened a fresh notebook. The first words she wrote were simple. He left with a promise. He returned with a son. And in that return, I found the rest of my story. Over the next weeks, Margaret began writing every day. Samuel helped around the house, but more than that, he became family, filling the quiet spaces not with noise, but with presence. They cooked together, read together, and even started planning a small garden under the oak tree. One morning, Samuel surprised her with a plaque for the front porch. It read, "The Ellis Avery Home. Established by love, rebuilt by memory." Margaret cried when she saw it, not from grief, but from a strange, wonderful joy she hadn't felt since she was a girl in love. By early autumn, the garden beneath the oak tree had begun to bloom. Wild flowers. Samuel had planted, sprouted in soft bursts of yellow, lavender, and blue. Butterflies danced through the branches, and neighbors walking by would often stop, smile, and linger longer than usual. One day, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from a local librarian who had heard about her story through a friend at the market. "Mrs. Ellis, I heard there's a story being written under that beautiful oak tree of yours, and I wonder, would you consider sharing it with our senior reading circle? We meet every Thursday at the library. Your story, even just a chapter, might touch more hearts than you realize." Margaret held the letter in her hands for a long time, heart beating fast. She hadn't imagined sharing what she wrote. It had been for her, for Thomas, for peace. But maybe peace was meant to be passed on. She agreed. The following Thursday, Samuel drove her to the library. She wore a navy cardigan and the pearl earrings she hadn't worn in years. Her hands trembled as she opened her notebook to the first page. The room was full. Not just seniors, younger adults too. People with curious faces, warm smiles, waiting quietly. She cleared her throat and began. He left with a promise. He returned with a son. And in that return, I found the rest of my story. By the time she reached the letter from Thomas, half the room was in tears. Some held tissues, others held hands. When she finished, a silence followed, but not an awkward one thick with emotion, with reverence. Then applause. Long, heartfelt applause. After the reading, people came up to her, men and women her age, some older, some younger. One woman hugged her and whispered, "You just gave me permission to hope again." A man leaned in and said, "My wife passed 2 years ago. I thought that was the end of my story, but maybe it's just a new chapter." Even the librarian had tears in her eyes. "You didn't just tell your story," she said. "You brought ours to life." Samuel stood quietly beside Margaret, proud but humble. Back at home that night, Margaret sat under the oak tree, the stars blinking above, the music box in her lap. She looked at Samuel and said, "It's strange. I waited my whole life for an ending, but I think what I found was a beginning." Samuel smiled. The best ones often come late. Winter approached, but Margaret's heart had never felt warmer. The story she read at the library had traveled farther than she ever imagined. Within weeks, the librarian called her again, not with a simple thank you, but with an invitation. "The local paper wants to do a piece on you," she said excitedly, "and a regional radio station is asking if you'd be willing to read an excerpt of your journal on air." Margaret laughed at first. Who would want to hear about a 74-year-old woman's old heartbreak? But Samuel, standing at her side, gently corrected her. "Everyone who's ever waited. Everyone who's ever wondered what might have been. Everyone who's ever needed to believe in love again." She agreed. The article was published the following Sunday. The Woman Who Waited 52 Years. A story of love, loss, and one final letter. It featured a photo of Margaret sitting beneath the oak tree, music box in her hands, and Samuel standing just behind her with a quiet smile. The story went viral, shared on local forums, then national blogs. Soon, strangers were sending letters to her doorstep from across the country. One woman in Vermont wrote, "I buried my first love's letters in a shoebox after he left for Vietnam. After reading your story, I found them again. And I cried. And I healed." A man from Texas sent a photo of a tree he had planted with his granddaughter. "We call it the legacy tree. Inspired by yours." And then came the invitations from high schools, writing clubs, even retirement communities. They all wanted Margaret to speak, to share her words, not as a celebrity, but as a woman who carried time in her heart and turned it into something hopeful. With Samuel driving, she started saying yes. They traveled together, two companions bound by memory and fate. Margaret shared her story in churches, bookstores, libraries. Young people approached her with tears in their eyes, telling her about long-distance heartbreaks and letters they never sent. She always told them the same thing. Love that waits is love that lives, and sometimes what you're waiting for is not a person, but a piece of yourself you had to find first. Her story became more than a personal journey. It became a bridge between generations, between the past and what still might be, between silence and voice. Margaret continued writing. Her journal became a book, modestly printed by a local press, titled The Oak Tree Letters. On the dedication page, she wrote, "To Thomas, who taught me how to wait, and to Samuel, who reminded me why." The final chapter of the book ends like this. "I waited 52 years. I thought I was waiting for him. But in truth, I was waiting for the moment I'd remember that love never disappears. It simply takes on a new shape, in a swing, in a smile, in a sun, and in a quiet knock on the door that finally opened everything. Now, dear viewer, have you ever waited for someone or something that seemed forever out of reach? Did this story remind you of a letter never sent, a door never opened, or a love that still lives in memory? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever believed in second chances. Like, subscribe, and don't miss the next chapter in our series of love, time, and unexpected reunions. Because sometimes, forever starts late.